71st out of 164 countries on its 2017 corruption index released in February this year. That's down 7 notches from the previous one. Today, figures released by Corruption Watch show that decline may yet continue, with a number of areas of concern highlighted in its half-year report. What is encouraging, though, is the willingness of citizens to fight against wrongdoing. The NGO says from the 1st of January to the 30th of June this year, nearly 2,500 cases of corruption were lodged with it. Well, the Executive Director, David Lewis, joins us now for a discussion. Good evening to you, David, and as always, thank you for talking to us. I mean, essentially, are we losing or winning the fight against corruption?
It's very difficult to say, but if you're trying to measure the extent of corruption. But, as you said in your intro, I mean, we take comfort from the fact that people have not accepted this as a way of life and that they're still willing to report and to come forward, and that's the good news.
Is that a growing trend? I mean, do you think South Africans are now fed up and they want to push back, they want to fight corruption by, for example, reporting it more?
I think so. This has been our model all along, and it underlines a number of things. I mean, not least of all, the absolute centrality of whistleblowing in combating corruption. And that's why we've asked people to report. And they seem to respond favourably and appreciatively to learning what is going on. Because, in interviews like this and reports like that, we're intent on reporting back to the public what they collectively tell us, and it encourages further reporting.
All right, so we tend to think of corruption in terms of its grand scale, the state capture project, for example. But in a sense, that's merely the fish rotting from the head. What are you hearing from the ground?
Well, we're pretty unusual in our focus on what is very misleadingly called petty corruption. We get our fair share of the stuff that makes the headlines of the morning newspaper. But we're very intent on exposing petty corruption. I mean, this is the kind of, the gogo who pays to get a prescription filled in the clinic queue, and the kid who doesn't get school lunch because it's been stolen by the supplier or the principal. These are the kinds of incidents of corruption that impact on everyday lived reality for most South Africans.
So let's talk about some of your areas of concern. Let's start with schools, for example. I mean, what? Sextortion? Sexual favors for marks?
Mm-hmm. I mean, these are the most disturbing reports that we get, and we're by no means the first to chronicle this, but this really, as it were, comes from the horse's mouth. And yes, that's what it is. I mean, teachers approaching schoolgirls, sometimes schoolboys, and saying to them, you're going to fail your exam, you're not going to get into grade 10, you're not going to get a university pass, but I can fix it for you. And it's exactly the same as a bribe, except that the kids in question don't have any currency other than their bodies, and that's the reality, and it is incredibly disturbing. I mean, it really demands much greater official attention and public attention. I mean, what do you do about this? But it's appalling.
That's on a small scale, but we've also seen, of course, around infrastructure, particularly in schools. I mean, the fact that children continue to die in pit latrines because sometimes there's corruption in terms of how schools are built and what's gone on there.
Yeah. Now, when we first opened our doors, we were surprised to get the volume of reports that we received about schools' corruption, and I think that one of the reasons for that is that people who might not be otherwise inclined to report corruption do when they see it impact on children. It's real like stealing candy from kids kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons but also because there is a lot of corruption there, because they're vulnerable.
David, does crime pay? I mean, we see all of this corruption, whether it's on a small scale, whether it is on a grand scale, but we don't always see tough consequences for those who are fingered. So, does crime pay?
Well, the reality is that at the moment, the risk of getting involved in corruption, whether petty or grand, is in fact very low. I think it's increasing. I think if communities rejected it and exposed it more often, it would be one consequence. But, you know, this, in the second half of this year, what we want to do is to mount a campaign asking people to report experiences of corruption in healthcare and policing, which they do in large numbers anyway. And that's why crime does pay at the moment, because I'm afraid that many police units are complicit in this, and that's what we really want to tackle.
Whether it's the police, whether it's the schools, why shouldn't people be corrupt? We've seen, for example, the SOEs being theatres of corruption.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, you know, I would like to think, and I'm not really sure how to go about doing this, but that people could not be corrupt because they care about the consequences that their actions have on others.
On the society.
You know, it's difficult to credit somebody stealing school lunch. It's difficult to credit somebody, you know, demanding sex from a high school girl for passing exams. I mean, it does say something. I mean, the latter says something about the extent of gender-based violence in the country, which says something about our care for others. Basically.
So how do we create then a culture that becomes intolerant of corruption, however small, however large?
Well, you know, this might sound a little limp-wristed, but I think by public conversations of this sort, you know, and we've got to keep on having them. I mean, that's what our overwhelming mission has been from day one, to try and stimulate an informed, active public discussion. And I think it is the absolute sort of ground zero for dealing with corruption. But then the police have to be got in shape, the procurement laws have to be tightened up and enforced better. There are a whole series of technical reforms, but fundamentally it has to be rejected by the public, and they have to demonstrate that rejection.
Well, I suppose one can commend you at least for releasing this type of reporter as often as you do, as regularly as you do, because I think that helps to keep a highlight, a spotlight on these issues. David Lewis, thank you very much for joining us. David Lewis, the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, with us in studio. Back to Francis.
Thanks, Bongani. Let's look at the numbers.